Hello, everyone. We have a great show for you today. This is the newest episode of Hell Island, and on today's show, Prince Harry has officially arrived in London. What the hell is he doing here? Thought we got rid of him here. But he is back because King Charles, his father, has been diagnosed with cancer. Some pretty major news. We'll break that all down. Also, what they're trying to be, at least, the government in waiting, Keir Starmer's Labour Party, is supposedly unwavering over a major £28 billion green investment that they say is desperately needed after some have been briefing to the media that they're planning to ditch that funding once they get into power. But we are starting today's show with a bit of policy and a little bit of kind of Tory craziness, as well as Liz Truss announced a new group of the Conservative Party, and we will break down what she had to say. A popular Conservative Party, which, given Liz Truss's approval ratings, may be a little bit ironic. All right, so we are also pleased today to welcome back Myron Michaelides. Myron, thank you so much for joining us here this week.
Pleasure to be here as always.
All right, yeah, so got to start with this Liz Truss big announcement in The Guardian. It was an event intended to mark the reinvigoration of right-wing conservatism, as The Guardian puts it. But before the first speaker took the stage on Tuesday morning, the popular conservative group had splintered. Of the 4 MPs billed to speak, just Liz Truss and Jacob Rees-Mogg were present. The former cabinet minister, Ranil Jayawardena, regarded by some as a rising star of the Tory right, pulled out on Monday with a swipe at his fellow panelist, and Simon Clarke, a former another Trussite former cabinet minister, was removed from the lineup by the organizers 2 weeks ago after calling for Rishi Sunak to be ousted. So it seems like a kind of group, a faction that's developing, definitely around some of the kind of more right-wing, both on the economy and both socially, ideas that propelled the short-lived Liz Truss premiership. But it almost kind of even in their launching, it seems like they're a little bit shy about what they really want to do. And it's almost as if, for them, it seems it's kind of crazy to even consider this, that Rishi Sunak seems to be in too powerful a position right now for them to come out and really say, we want to change the Conservative Party. We really disagree with what Rishi Sunak's doing, even though he is, hovering, the Conservative Party under his leadership is hovering anywhere from like 25 to like 30% in the polls at the moment. So really kind of a not, at least for the moment, not incredibly inspiring launch of this group, Myron. But I've heard a lot of very smart analysts talking about how they could be the future of the party in the wake of a Labour victory and an inevitable leadership contest. What was your reaction to some of this news that was coming out this morning?
Well, I mean, I think that, I think a lot of this kind of stuff around like PopCon, this isn't the first kind of splinter faction group within the Conservative Party. Like, we've had the New Conservatives, I think there was this particular one about the Common Sense Conservatives, which are like kind of more kind of anti-lockdown conservatives. And so we've seen these kind of like proliferation of like different kind of internal groups, often on the right of the Conservative Party. And I think a lot of this is basically positioning for after the election, because I think a lot of these MPs think that Rishi Sunak is going to lose the next election. And I think that that's one of the reasons why, even within, what you talked about kind of with the MPs, pulling out of speaking, I think is that everyone's trying to position themselves as a potential either leadership candidate or to be associated with a potential leadership candidate after the election. And I think that's what a lot of these kind of groups are based around. I do think, though, that it's based on an assumption that just as how, when the Labour Party was out of power, it shifted to the left, that when the Conservative Party are out of power, they're going to shift to the right, and that has historically been the case. So, after Conservatives lost in '97, you had, a move kind of to the right with Michael Howard specifically. But I do think that it's still up in the air. I mean, I think that you do still have, a lot of prominent moderate conservatives, like, for example, Penny Mordaunt, right, still lurking in the background. Before he was, in my opinion, basically doomed to the Home Secretary job. The most popular minister among members wasn't Kemi Badenoch, wasn't anyone on the right of the party, but actually it was James Cleverly. So I think that actually I think that there's an assumption that kind of these kind of right wing factions are going to be the future, but I think that that's actually a lot more in contention than people think.
Interesting. Yeah. So, and it does seem to be, I think, indicated, somewhat towards what you're saying there, with the very kind of, uncomfortable, shall we say, not entirely swimmingly launch of this PopCon group. So Ranil Jayawardena, who is a current member of parliament, obviously former minister as well, I believe. He says, we've made progress and we need to stick with the plan to scrap the bureaucracy that's held Britain back. Labour would take us back to square one. I won't be there tomorrow. I'll keep making the positive case for growth from the common ground of British politics, essentially saying that, these, Truss and Rees-Mogg are just too, much out of the mainstream for the moment. And so do you think this is going to be something, this kind of, unstable launch of this group is something for Rishi Sunak and the kind of centrist, kind of, I guess, like maybe it'd be fair to say, One Nation Tories to be a little bit more confident about?
I mean, I think it definitely means that they're not going to be as potent a force as I think the popcons probably would have liked. I mean, it is so strange that kind of, the Tory party's moved so far to the right that, Rishi Sunak, who was seen, when he came into Parliament as this kind of hard, white kind of Brexiteer, is now kind of seen as like the moderate, sensible kind of conservatives. I mean, it's absolutely, I think it really is a testament to how much the Conservative Party has changed. And I think also the problem with kind of these popcorns and the New Conservative Foundation as well is that they're kind of retreading a lot of kind of ground that isn't very electable. Right, so I think the big thing of kind of the kind of Liz Truss popcorns was basically kind of getting rid of bureaucracy, and kind of a lot of culture war stuff. So I think Liz Truss thought about like collectivists who are doing horrible things like fighting for LGBTQ rights, right? But actually, it's very hard to argue to slim down the state when you've had 13 years of austerity and the state basically has already been cut to the bone. There's very little you can do to slim it down at this point. And also, even with the cultural stuff, I mean, we've kind of seen, I think, not only in the UK, but also, Australia and in America, a lot of this kind of culture war, kind of, anti-LGBTQ, stuff about trans rights, it simply isn't electable. I do a lot of campaigning. I go to the doorstep. Not once has anyone talked to me about, what a woman is or any of this stuff.
Yeah.
And, you've seen, I know this is kind of, across the pond, but, Ron DeSantis based his entire run for the president on the idea that kind of culture wars and wokeism was the future of right-wing politics, and that's what could kind of propel, the right, forward. And he absolutely failed. And so I think that kind of, I think that this is kind of a bridge to nowhere. I think that, yeah, I think that a lot of these policies are either already done or just not. They don't get votes, I think.
Yeah, that's very interesting because it seems like definitely true with what you said about Ron DeSantis. I have to imagine, if it can't be done, over in America where this stuff really is traditionally much more fertile ground, it's going to be very, very hard for it to get done at a pretty broad scale in the UK. But I think there is this kind of interesting thing where I feel like we have seen a pretty big potency, at least among the conservative base, which will obviously be choosing the next leader of the Conservative Party after a potential leadership challenge if Labour to win, Rishi Sunak were to resign then. And they do seem to be very much bought into the issue of net migration numbers and getting immigration down, and that combined with some of the kind of economic management strategies that we've seen from Liz Truss. Do you think that could be, even if it's not maybe electorally popular, Do you think that could be a winning campaign for maybe not, or for whoever comes next, especially if Reform UK, for example, does better than expected in this upcoming election and kind of running on that anti-migrant platform?
I think definitely there'll be a lot more pressure to move to the right if Form UK do make gains. I am a bit skeptical about that as well because the Brexit Party, which is basically what the Reform UK kind of threat
Hmm.
is kind of based on, right? The idea that the Brexit Party would kind of lose the 2019 election to the Conservatives. Brexit was a very potent issue then. If you look at what Reform's platform is now, I mean, sure, it's kind of, slightly to one of the conservatives, but it's mostly about kind of, libertarian issues about, lowering tax, some vague stuff about kind of the border and immigration. I don't think that, especially post-Truss, is going to kind of galvanize as much support as as people think it will. But I definitely think that running on kind of the idea of kind of the Rwanda deal was kind of destroyed by Rishi Sunak, and we actually could have been a tough on immigration. And if you vote for me, Suella Braverman or Kemi Badenoch to be
Mm.
Tory leader, I'll kind of restore the kind of heart of conservatism. I think that definitely is going to be a strand in the kind of post Sunak Conservative Party. Though again, I think that at the end of the day, the real proof is whether it's actually going to win votes, and I think especially with kind of Starmer and Starmer's Labour taking a pretty hardline stance on immigration, trying to make sure that kind of that isn't as much of an issue, and also I think the failure of the Conservatives on immigration policy. I think that that's not going to be tenable in a general election. Maybe in a leadership election, but not in the general.
Yeah, the leadership election for sure. But you feel like the Labor has kind of closed the gap between the two enough to really look at and really not make immigration a very big issue in terms of just the broader electorate, not necessarily just the Tory base.
Mm. Well, I mean, I think that I think immigration is definitely still going to be a big issue, but I don't necessarily think it's going to be framed in the way of kind of we're tough. The Conservatives are tough on immigration and Labour's weak on immigration, because there's a very easy response to that from anyone who's been alive in this country for 13 years, which is that if immigration is such a big problem, why haven't you fixed it yet? Well, you've been in
Yeah.
power for 14 years, right? And so I think that's what makes it really hard for the Conservatives to kind of go on kind of cultural and immigration issues, is that uh, is that they've had time to fix it and they haven't. And I think that the British public are going to see through that.
Yeah, and that obviously can be, kind of the common refrain, for any major policy, right? Is that you had all this time, you're kind of ineffective. It's, your time is over. And I think, yeah, that could be a very, very effective policy and just kind of rhetoric that we've seen really a lot from, Keir Starmer, but also really just naturally bubbling up among so many people in the country. Just, this kind of similar, just kind of continuous government, although it has been, if you look at it from the coalition to, someone like Boris Johnson to someone like Rishi Sunak, it's like, definitely a shifting in terms of the steering of the country. But it still has been obviously that conservative government all the way through. Mark Littlewood, who until recently led the Anti-Tax Institute of Economic Affairs, told The Room, "I'm personally immovable in my view that Rishi Sunak should leave the Conservatives into the next general election." And no one really went as far as to say, I want the job, because it seems like a pretty, it seems like they're almost kind of waiting to pounce for the inevitable time where Rishi Sunak truly really fails of his own accord. But because they really did go on here to eviscerate the policies, Conservative Party Vice Chair, former Conservative Party Vice Chair, what was his nickname? They were trying to give him 30p Lee. 30p Lee.
Yeah, good old 30p Lee.
Yeah, 30p Lee. Lee Anderson attacked the government over its approach to net zero. He called for the coal mines to be open in the north of England and for people to be able to choose to pay green levies on their energy bills. We're burning coal in our power stations, but it's foreign coal, he said. How's that contributing to net zero? It's absolute nonsense. He also said his constituents weren't lying awake at night worrying about net zero. The parliamentary candidate Mary Fraser, who is standing in Chris Grayling's Tory safe seat of Epsom and Ewell, launched an extended attack on Sunak's smoking ban and the COVID lockdown, saying the ban would create a ludicrous two-tier system where in the years 50 years to come, a 50-year-old man would be able to legally buy his cigarettes, but his 49-year-old wife will not. And then, there's this whole thing about COVID lockdowns, nanny state, all that kind of stuff. I feel like what Mary Fraser's saying here is not really it's kind of ridiculous of its own accord, but the stuff about Lee Anderson, who really was one, I mean, you may disagree, but one of the more kind of politically astute of the 2019 intake for the Conservatives, this coal mining issue and this net zero issue connected to the just complete economic just downfall of the North in a lot of ways. Do you think that there is something there when it comes to that as a kind of broader political threat?
I love I love Lee Anderson going full Arthur Scargill. We opened the mines. Oh, it reminds me of when he took a very Maoist turn in Parliament and talked about sending students into the fields to pick potatoes instead of migrants. Horseshoe theory is very real. But I think that I definitely think that the impact of kind of degradation on kind of the North and kind of, that regional inequality. Definitely it's been it was a driving kind of feature of Boris Johnson's campaign. And so I think it could have some relevance. But then again, we face the same kind of problem, which is that, Boris Johnson ran on leveling up in 2019. It's now 2024. What have you done? Right? So again, I think it really is going to be hard to kind of make that argument, at least in this election. And I think in the next election, I think you're going to see a lot more kind of investment, I think probably get into later, in the North, or just in general under a Labour government.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that, if we're looking at, 2028, right, I think that argument is not going to be as much of an issue because, a lot of that kind of depredation in the North comes from 13 years of, conservative budget cuts, right, that have weakened a lot of kind of those economic activities in the North. And, the cutting of Northern Powerhouse, which was supposed to revitalize kind of Northern industry. Again, I think the fundamental thing is that the Conservatives are bound by 14 years that they've had in government and the fact that the country simply isn't as good as it was in 2010 or isn't better than it was in 2010.
Yeah, what would you say? Because I feel like if there's only Lee Anderson kind of speaking in this kind of ridiculous, we need to restart, refire the coal plants in 2024 type of mindset, that to a lot of people, especially kind of the older people, who make such a, I thought American older people voted in heavy numbers, like the British, the older people really do know how to vote in heavy numbers. Like if they remember that time where, the mines are open, and then you have Keir Starmer saying, we're not going to have money left. We're going to have to stay by these really tight fiscal rules, and then even if he is kind of promising some sort of green investment or something like that, kind of in a more abstract sense, the lot of stuff that I've been hearing in the media when it comes to Keir Starmer speaking publicly, Rachel Ray speaking publicly, is very much, we need to keep the fiscal situation very similar to the way it is now. Do they run the risk of, kind of losing out this message to a very ridiculous message in what Lee Anderson's putting down?
I think that I think that kind of, and we kind of saw this with Boris Johnson, which is that he tried to, and even go back to Theresa May, where kind of there was this kind of red Toryism of trying to kind of make kind of the Tory economics move away from the Thatcherite consensus and be a lot more kind of statist in its economic policy. I think that's a very hard position to take when it's not backed up by a personality, let's say, like Boris Johnson, because I think that, the Conservatives fundamentally have a reputation of being fiscally prudent, of being kind of the competent managers of the economy. And I think so and historically in almost every election, the main critique of the Labour Party by the Conservatives has been that they're spending too much. And so I think it's very hard for them to actually take that position of kind of, Lee Anderson, of kind of doing more investment there. Again, they tried to, during the Boris Johnson years, and I think they failed. And I think on the thing of like, Keir Starmer kind of being very rigid on kind of fiscal rules. I mean, of course, because he's running in an election, and I think a lot of people don't understand that kind of what you do in an election campaign is you convince people of things that you aren't already associated with, right? Everyone knows that like a Labour government spends more money. Everyone knows a Labour government taxes the rich more. Everyone knows a Labour government like builds more council houses, right? Those are the things that like are instinctually kind of like associated with the party. And so the thing that we're trying to do in this campaign is kind of prove the things that people aren't so sure on, which is whether we can manage the finances, which is whether we can, do all of that spending without raising taxes. But I think that if we do win the election, I think that, and this is the pattern with all Labour governments, is that usually they say very kind of fiscally conservative things during an election period, and then spend a lot more. I mean, I think, the most Tony Blair was going to spend in 1997, the most he promised was £100 million on the NHS. He went on to spend more on education and the NHS than any other government since 1945. So I think that, again, if we're looking forward to 2028, I think you will see a lot more investment. And I think that that will kind of undercut the kind of Lee Anderson argument of kind of, basically a reheated version of leveling up, which again, a lot of people especially in the north, already have seen as discredited, especially with stuff like the cutting of HS2 down to Birmingham, right?
Yeah. That was, yeah. I feel like if you are, yeah, because the instinctual stuff with the party is so. I guess what you're saying is like you're making the kind of bet, and Labor is making the bet more broadly that they can kind of go up to, even if we don't really know what Rishi Sunak is going to say on kind of the leveling up and what to do about the North and things like that. We don't really know truly. It's kind of hard to, if I was a conservative, staffer trying to make the case for why we should get, 19 years in power or whatever that is, I would feel like I'd have a very, very tough time. But like if they do try and make a case about, we're going to try, revitalize the North doing X, Y, Z, and then Starmer, or do any kind of, more spending, revitalizing the economy, whatever. And then you have Starmer coming in and saying, we're going to stick to this very, very tight managed, situation. And do you think the prehistoric or the more historical notions of Labor as being this spending party are going to be still kind of stronger or more foundational in voters' minds as opposed to, what Starmer happens to be saying in this given campaign? Is that kind of the bet that Labor's making?
I think, in a sense, yes. In the sense that kind of, I think that that Labour is trying to say that kind of we can spend money, we can have investment in public services, which are all at the moment very popular, obviously because of the background of austerity. I
Mm-hmm.
think that the main concern that voters have is, can Labour do that without raising taxes? Because at the same time, and I think I read once in an article that the British electorate wants the tax rate of the United States with the social safety net of like Sweden, right? And this is that we want very low taxes but very, very good public services. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think the main kind of thing that Labour's trying to do is basically say, listen, we can do some investment in the NHS and education and in the environment and kind of creating green jobs, but we can also do it in a way that doesn't mean that we're doing what used to be called tax and spend, where you tax and then you spend, right? Because a lot of people don't want to be taxed, especially not now.
Yeah, that is definitely a delicate fiscal line to walk with. The playing of people's very kind of intense financial situations in the wake of the cost of living crisis. Some of the other comments from this, we have Jacob Rees-Mogg declaring the age of the Davos man is over. Liz Truss urged her colleagues to stop worrying about getting a job in Sunak's government. Instead, take the fight to the left-wing extremists running the UK's institutions instead. The group also aims to pile pressure on the Prime Minister to cut taxes, adopt hardline policies on immigration, and leave the European Convention on Human Rights. Many Tory MPs on the right of the party decided to stay away. One MP said privately, "I'm not sure what space this is meant to fill. The Conservative Growth Group already advocates libertarian economics, and the common sense conservatives talk about cultural issues." Kwasi Kwarteng, meanwhile, formerly Truss's chancellor and closest political ally, who really had a rough time as chancellor, to say the least, he pointedly decided to announce that he will not be seeking re-election as an MP the same day that this group launched. One person who was president was the former Brexit Party leader Nigel Farage, in his capacity as a GB News presenter. A few years ago, the Tories found to be associating with him risked suspension from the party. But on Tuesday, attendees were lining up to take pictures with him, saying that he was not, Farage at the time saying he did not seek to join the Conservatives. This was today, he said, given what they stand for, but did not rule out standing for the Parliament with Richard Tice's party Reform. So yeah, you have that kind of Tory grouping relatively being mocked by Jonathan Ashworth of Labour wrote to the panelists on Monday night asking whether they still supported unfunded tax cuts and the use of offshore tax haven. And the Lib Dems published a social media graphic of the top of the pop con's greatest hits, including Common, Etonian People, and It's the End of the Tories as We Know It, and I Feel Fine. So that's, I think it's making, some of those slogans into some songs there. But yeah, I definitely, looking through some of this and looking through some of, recent British political history, it's very, very hard just broadly to see how this finds much of a political base in the current poor economic situation, especially when we just saw how bad unfunded tax cuts can be in the economy, beyond a pretty large sect, I would say, of the Conservative membership and the Conservative base. All right. So with that being said, we have some interesting news. This has been, all over BBC. No surprise at the moment. The king has cancer. He has been pictured for the first time since his cancer diagnosis was announced on Monday evening. The queen and king are traveling apparently to Sandringham in Norfolk by helicopter. And it came as Prince Harry is now back in London to visit his father. So seems we don't really know how serious the cancer seems to be yet. This was after he was in the hospital for the last few weeks with getting treatment for an enlarged prostate, but I think they said it was in a different area, not prostate cancer or anything like that. But no word on what the cancer is. We saw it was very raising a lot of eyebrows. Some presenters on TV wearing black last night as this news was kind of coming through. What is your just kind of reaction to this general news, and how do you think it's going to impact the country? Obviously, so close to the death of Queen Elizabeth.
Well, I mean, I think I am. I'm very exceptional for my kind of age demographic in the sense I actually am a pretty big supporter of the monarchy as an institution. But I think that regardless, and I actually think that one of the best things, one of the not best, but I think one of the things that's really heartened me is the fact that even kind of Republic and the kind of anti-monarchist Republican groups have paid their respects and kind of said that I hope King Charles gets well soon.
Mm-hmm.
I think that yeah, I think that having cancer for anyone in any family is always tough. I think it's very brave of him to come out about it publicly. There's a lot of stigma about coming out about it. And yeah, I think that there definitely is kind of. I mean, I remember, when I first got the notification, I think a lot of people, yeah, get flashbacks to, the 8th of September. I believe, yes, when the Queen died, and especially kind of people wearing black, and because it was 10 days of mourning, it was really a period of British history that we hadn't really seen in that many people hadn't seen in their lifetimes. And so I think the fact that is kind of in danger of kind of happening again, I think is very yeah, I think it will definitely have a profound effect. I mean, from what I know, the cancer is benign, and obviously he's going to get the best medical treatment possible. So I don't think that I think that this is not the last we've seen of King Charles, right? But I think it is very good that he's been open about it. I heard a story that the amount of men who went to get checked for prostate cancer actually went up
Mm.
dramatically after he talked about being admitted for kind of checking for prostate cancer. And I think that's actually one of the great things about having a monarch is that when you have a person who the vast majority of people like and respect. It means that they have a public platform to raise awareness about really important issues in a way that kind of a divisive, kind of partisan prime minister or president, can't. So
Yeah, that is definitely interesting because obviously there is a big, I think throughout society across the world, the issue with just men going to the doctor and, being, oh, I don't want to go get this checked up, it'll be fine, all that stuff. Yeah, so it's definitely very interesting and, good to see. It seems like the monarch will be postponing public duties but will undertake state duties and continue to meet with the prime minister weekly. So it seems like, the cancer was caught pretty early, and things. He'll be able to continue the, I guess, important stuff that he does. But it's all relative there.
yeah.
With regards to the public, do you think the average British person's reaction to this news is just like oh, kind of hope he gets better soon, but not something that's going to be really they're not feeling too strongly about either which way.
Yeah, yeah. I think the main thing people are going to say is that someone that they know, right, has cancer, and that's horrible. And I hope they get well soon. I think that's probably going to be the main kind of thing. And again, I think people, and I think this was the thing with the death of the Queen, is that kind of people kind of talk about the monarchy as kind of being out of touch and kind of being kind of above the public, but I think the real kind of thing that the British monarchy has been able to do right is that in many ways, when the Queen died, people knew relatives, especially after COVID, who had died, right? And so I think that often, whether it's a cancer diagnosis or a death in the family, I think the monarchy allows kind of British people to come together around kind of shared experiences, because even if they don't personally know Prince King Charles, sorry, still hard to get used to it. Didn't know the Queen or didn't know King Charles. They know the experiences that they're going through, because at the end of the day, they're still human beings.
So you see it kind of more as like an outlet for the country to express, grief or, relate or process situations that they've been feeling in their personal lives.
Definitely, definitely, yeah. I think that is probably one of the main functions of kind of of the monarchy, I'd say, in this country. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you think because it definitely has been, I guess, a relatively quiet period since the passing of Queen Elizabeth. Obviously, we had the coronation back in May, for King Charles. Do you think the monarchy has really kind of moved into a new age with King Charles? Like, has it lost some of the purchase with King Charles, who is not, I wouldn't say an unpopular figure, but from what I understand, nowhere near as popular as the Queen was.
Yeah, I definitely think that kind of, I don't think that King Charles at his coronation was ever going to be as popular as
Mm-hmm.
Queen Elizabeth, just because a big part of why people liked Queen Elizabeth was that she was always there, right? Through, wars and, from, Attlee to Thatcher to Blair, right? No matter what happened in this country, she was always around. And you simply can't have that kind of association and this popularity with a new king. But I do think that, I mean, definitely, generally, we've seen the trend among younger people that kind of, they've been less and less kind of favorable towards the monarchy in general and the king in particular. A lot of that is because, there's been a big debate in this country about our colonial past, and for many people, the monarchy is a symbol of imperialism and colonialism. Um, but I think that um, generally, I do think that the role of the monarch has become a bit more politicized, though subtly. So you saw the thing about King
Mm-hmm.
Charles speaking at COP at COP, and him wearing the kind of tie with the Greece flag after Rishi Sunak said he was to
Yeah.
give the Greece marble with the Greek marbles. So I definitely think, I mean, he's always been an activist and kind of used his position to kind of for charitable causes and kind of for subtle forms of activism. And so I do think that the king, I think I think he's using his position a lot more to kind of, I guess, express kind of certain values in the country even if kind of the like a commitment to the environment or kind of, an acknowledgement of kind of, our imperial past, even if kind of the current government of the day isn't necessarily doing that, I think.
Do you see that as a like kind of threat to the monarchy? Just this view of the base of support that really supports the monarchy. I'm imagining it pretty overlaps. Obviously not entirely, but the strongest supporters of the monarchy are most likely to be the strongest conservative supporters. Older in the country. Do you think that the king kind of coming out taking these positions that are kind of not, I would say, anti, not necessarily leftist, in any sort of way, but kind of, I guess, centristy liberal. Do you think coming out taking these positions in favor of the environment, kind of making a bit of a fool out of Rishi Sunak by wearing that Greek tie, do you think that's going to pose a threat to the monarchy by alienating a space, or do you think it's just kind of a natural evolution and maybe might even pick up some younger admirers?
I mean, I think that a lot of these performances are subtle enough that they don't kind of they fly under the radar for most people. Like most
Yeah.
people are going to be thinking about what tie the king is wearing. I mean, I have heard the argument of kind of that this is kind of politicization, and that if he did this under a Labour government, people would be up in arms. But I do think that like a lot of these positions, like for example, acknowledging our imperial past, at least to some extent,
Hmm.
and caring about the environment are in the broad mainstream, even of like center-right conservatives.
Hmm.
Um, and so I don't think that that's necessarily going to kind of weaken the basis of kind of the monarchy. No,
He's definitely not anywhere close to doing what his namesake did all those years ago. That is for
definitely,
sure.
yeah, not yet. He's still a couple steps away from the
Yeah.
chopping block, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Very interesting. How many rules in the kind of I actually was lucky enough to take about a year ago or so a tour of the parliament. It's very interesting to see it, like how many of the rules they have in there are directly because of King Charles coming into the chamber and trying to do some un I guess democratic things. I don't know if you call the process of democracy going on in Great Britain at the time, but
Definitely unparliamentary.
unparliamentary. That's probably a better term. Yeah, so it's definitely going to be very very interesting to keep a close eye on all things King Charles, as I'm sure the BBC will be doing for us as this kind of yeah, that's kind of interesting because the BBC really does have this role as like the number one source of news from the royal family,
Mm.
and being this kind of like or just breathless type of there's pictures of like long lens shots of Harry pulling up to London and the king leaving his home going to I think Sandringham. Yeah, so do you think that will keep driving some of the public sympathy, because I would have to guess that plays a pretty big role, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually I have on a second screen the live stream of Buckingham Palace, and I've
Oh.
had it on for the last 2 days. No, 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 but I do think that I mean, I think that the BBC definitely, when it comes to stuff like for example, the coronation or the King's funeral, usually is the kind of go-to, partly because in its remit is to kind of promote British values and British culture.
Hmm.
I do think that actually, I mean, I think a lot of also kind of stuff on the royal family often comes from like the tabloid press, like especially when
Mm.
it comes to the stuff about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. A lot of that was kind of the tabloid press.
More
Um,
dramatic. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But I think that definitely when it comes to, I don't necessarily think if it will make the king remain popular or make him more popular, because I think in Britain that's kind of just seen as kind of the standard of how the
Mm.
royals are kind of
Yeah.
covered. Um, but I do think that kind of I think there was a lot during the coronation of kind of worries that kind of that maybe he won't be as successful of a king, and that he's gonna be a lot more unpopular. But I think that generally I think he's done a pretty good job, and I think that especially with this whole thing, the way that he's handled his cancer, I think there's going to be a lot more sympathy for him, and I think that when people do look back on kind of his reign, I think that this will be seen as kind of one of the first kind of major points in which kind of the country kind of rallied around him and kind of, in respect of him, I think.
Yeah, yeah. It's like it's gonna be. Yeah, I think just like the so much of what made I think the monarchy so successful is just being the kind of steady hand, always being there throughout the throughout the reign of Queen Elizabeth. I mean, I don't know. I doubt it's going to be any sort of like kind of major rally, but I definitely could see the kind of respect, the kind of moment where they say, okay, he's doing this, he's handling it in a graceful way. I think that will garner a lot of respect and just saying okay, he's doing what he's doing, and he's not really I guess not making a fool of himself essentially, and conducting himself with dignity and that kind of British stoicism that I think a lot of people, at least from the outside, associate with this island. So yeah.
Stiff upper lip and all that.
Exactly, exactly. All right, so moving on to our last story. So Keir Starmer has come out today saying the Labour's policy pledge to spend $28 billion a year on green investment is desperately needed as he reopened an issue that has become a source of tension within the party. So apparently, party sources have said as recently as last week that Starmer and the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, were planning to ditch the pledge, while the Shadow Chief Secretary of the Treasury all but confirmed the move a day later. However, comments from Starmer broadcast on Tuesday morning were welcomed by advocates of the pledge as a recommitment at a time where other senior party leaders had declined to use the figure. Yeah, so it seems to be $28 billion, major green investment here. It was kind of the center of the kind of excitement from what I've seen in terms of reason to be excited about a Labour government. One of the major things is that $28 billion in green investment seems to be just what I keep hearing as the pledge from a lot of Labour ministers going on TV. What do you make of this kind of back and forth situation in terms of a mixed messages from what is a normally under Starmer's reign a normally unified party?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely been kind of a thing about mixed messages. I think more of that's been kind of the interpretation of Labour's position from the media as much as it has been kind of what Labour have said themselves. I think that kind of there was a debate about whether or not they kind of dropped it. I think that a lot of that was kind of through implying rather than actually kind of having actual kind of explicit text about it. I think that what they've done is that they haven't dropped it as much as they've kind of qualified it. So if you look back at kind of what the Shadow Chief Secretary of the oh God, the names in this country are so long. When it was initially seen as being dropped, a lot of that wasn't necessarily saying we're not going to spend that money, but rather kind of, this is going to be, aligned with our fiscal rules and that. Basically, the position of Labour at the moment is that we will spend $20 billion, pounds, sorry, on
Hmm.
green jobs if we can afford it. I think that has
Mm.
been really the main kind of development when it comes to the policy, because I think that Labour's been under attack from the Conservatives. So, like Rishi Sunak kind of tested this argument out in PMQs a couple of weeks ago. That kind of, Labour was being fiscally irresponsible with this £28 billion that's all going to come from debt. And I think that there was also some changes because the original pledge that came about in 2021 was based on kind of, the effects of climate change offsetting the kind of debt that would be, spent via that pledge. And because the levels of debt, especially since the trust budget, have, changed over time, that kind of they felt that they needed to kind of qualify that, we will spend this money if we can. But I think it's good that, Starmer has, I think, now clarified the party's position. I think that, you know, I remember going to Labour conference and, seeing Ed Miliband kind of talk about this sum and kind of really actually pulling on kind of what Biden is doing in the US with the Inflation Reduction
Yeah.
Act and that kind of push towards kind of industrial policy. I think is going to be really good. And I think, going back to our previous argument about kind of, Lee Anderson and kind of revitalizing the North, I think a lot of these projects are going to be in the North. I think they're going
Mm.
to go a big way of kind of reducing kind of regional inequality. Again, I think that we could have been a lot better on the messaging, but I think that I'm glad that we've got at the moment now, I think, a coherent message. Um,
Yeah, so yeah, the debt and the fiscal rules that is, correct me if I'm wrong, that is related to economic growth.
Yeah, so I think that actually, because I actually believe that the fiscal rules, correct me if I'm wrong, actually the kind of reason that the 28 billion pound pledge was able to kind of stay for so long and is still staying is that the actual debt limits on the 28 billion pounds, the actual debt limits on the fiscal rules, only stop the increase in debt when it comes to day-to-day spending. So spending on the NHS, spending on education. The argument around the 28 billion pounds is basically that because this is kind of capital investment, because it's not, day-to-day spending, actually it still is kind of going by the fiscal rules. So that's kind of a loophole that they've kind of created there. But I do believe that those fiscal rules also have kind of a debt to GDP kind of
Mm.
limit. And I think the main concern was that kind of, especially because now, after the trust budget, we're in a lot more debt than we were, that actually, that 20 billion pound would get us closer to that debt limit than we, I think, would be comfortable with. So I think that, um, at the end of the day, I think that it's still, I think that again, it's good that we've clarified that we're still sticking to the fiscal rules and we're still spending this money. And I think that we actually can make that argument because when polled, this is a very popular policy, and I don't think that it will be. Again, I think the argument of kind of the Tories having reckless spending simply doesn't add up when you have huge amounts of debt under a Tory government. So again, I think that that won't be as big of an argument from the Conservatives as they might want it to be.
Yeah, and debt with no, economic growth attached to it, right? So it's like even if you're spending, you're making like a tax cut is so much less as we've seen. I think one of the best people who's ever put out a video explaining this is actually Jeremy Corbyn, and he had this ad like very very early on where he's just like, we give out this money to normal people. They spend it in the shops. They spend it, doing this, doing that. And then they'd go, to the millionaires and be like, oh, we put it, in stock buybacks and, just kind of internal investment stuff, things like that. And, when you do something like a tax cut, like that is such a, the things that have to go right for it to be some sort of major economic investment, I feel like are so many more than if you're saying, committing to building, green energy plants in the north, for example, which seems to be a much, smarter, policy with some sort of actual, this kind of, basis of, here it's been called the Green Industrial Revolution, Green New Deal back in America, like this I think, very, very smart way that we're probably going to have to, follow at some point. I think is the path for any sort of left of center government anywhere in the future is to make these necessary climate change investments immobilize, through making it both as an economic engine and environmental engine could be really really important. And as Keir Starmer says, we're going to need that investment. That's where the 28 billion pounds comes in.
Is this supposed to be Keir Starmer or James Bond villain? I can't quite tell.
No, yeah, it's a very I was Alan Partridge. I don't know.
Yeah.
You've done better. That investment is desperately needed for that mission. You can only understand the investment argument by understanding that we want to have clean power by 2030, and we need to borrow to invest to do that. That's a principle I believe in, and I'm absolutely happy to go out and defend. So, good to see. We're not doing fully, and of course, I guess Liz Truss believes that too with unfunded tax cuts. But, and of course, what we've said as we've got closer to the operationalization of this is that it has to be ramped up. The money has to be ramped up, and everything is subject to our fiscal rules. And of course, that's what's got some celebration from the IPPR North think tank director Zoe Billingham. But opposition to watering down the $28 billion commitment has come from across the spectrum, uniting Labour MPs from the party's left with others in the center, while business leaders have also thrown their weight behind it, including Jürgen Mayer, who's the former UK head of Siemens, the German industrial giant and major investor, who said last week that he proposed $28 billion a year investment in a low carbon economy was an absolute minimum. So this is $28 billion. Sorry, I keep saying dollars, pounds a year in the low carbon economy was a bare minimum. So yeah, this definitely seems to be a pretty necessary thing. It seems to be a thing that could actually level up parts of the North. But then we have these fiscal rules. And I feel like, just given what Starmer has said and the way the Labor Party has, kind of conducted itself in the past, it's always, I feel like just anyone who's kind of observing the Labor Party since Starmer's taken over, I feel like you always got to have that kind of thing in the back of your mind, like, oh, what if we get in there and the fiscal rules start to come up as a kind of backstop? And, kind of, we wish we could do it, but then, we have the fiscal rules. Do you think that is a legitimate concern, or would the kind of pressure be at that point too great to not do it?
I don't think that's a legitimate concern. I think that, again, the fiscal rules already kind of allow for kind of capital investment. And I think that the main argument for spending it with debt, which is that the debt that will have to go into anyway in order to kind of, for example, build dams to stop flooding or kind of, provide emergency assistance when people's homes are flooded, is going to be higher than the initial amount of money that we're going to spend in debt on this kind of, green prosperity plan. And I think that, again, I think that the fiscal rules are more for the election in showing that we are a fiscally responsible party and aren't going to simply spend money with higher taxes. Then are kind of, I think they're also going to be very important when it comes to government and how we govern. But I don't think it's going to stop that spending because, as you said, and I think actually what the former CEO of Siemens said that actually is really interesting because I think there's often been kind of claims of kind of businesses kind of interested in Starmer and interested in Labour at the moment because they're shifting to the right. Actually, what it seems like is that a lot of business has actually been supporting Labour and supporting Starmer because they've actually shifted to the left because they've seen after 13 years of Tory cuts and Tory austerity and unfunded tax cuts that actually the way that you get an economy growing and get businesses growing is through a state that regulates property rights, that can invest in kind of infrastructure, that you can transport materials across the country. So I think that we will be able to spend that amount of money. I think that spending combined with the changes to procurement is also going to be really, really important because if you look at our plans for procurement, it's also about kind of making sure that we only kind of spend money when it comes to firms that have unionized, when it comes to firms that have a net positive impact for the community. So it's not just going to be us kind of giving money to multi-million-dollar corporations. It's going to be us.
It's not a repeat of the Serco situation with the test and trace. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. It's not just kind of a no strings attached to kind of these big corporations. It's actually going to be meaning that kind of more of these communities aren't just economically prosperous, but also unionized and kind of are more sustainable economically, which I think has been a big problem, especially in the North for a while.
Yeah, so that is definitely going to be very, very interesting, and I feel like this it's definitely a tightrope that we've seen walking, because when Reeves was in front of business, over the last few days, she was being, bombarded with questions, especially from journalists about, do you really support the $28 billion figure now? And we've seen Starmer or Reeves, I think she was asked 10 times, and she said, fiscal stability, is going to come first. And I feel like that, that is going to always be, what if, we don't have the growth, growth just doesn't come, out of nowhere, and we don't have the 3% growth that they want to see. And then, it's going to be watered down. I feel like that is a situation that seems to be, very, very likely, especially, as we see, it is kind of a very, very common thing, and I think Starmer, we see with those connections to business, I feel like Siemens, if you're coming from the perspective of investing and building the way that Siemens is, I'm sure they're probably very, very happy to have a government that's like willing to build things. But I feel like Starmer, like what I think he has to do here to be successful and not just be this kind of very weak, kind of timid version that he has often seemed to be at times. I think to get to that full potential, he has to be not afraid to do things, even if it may not be the most safest course of action, I guess is the way to put it. What is the likelihood, in your opinion, of these fiscal rules about the growth and the debt to GDP limit holding firm through a prospective labor term in late 2024, early 2025, where they would presumably look to get some of the stuff off the ground?
I mean, I think that I, I mean, I hope that they hold firm. I think it's really important they hold firm because I think that if we get into power and we can't show that, we are fiscally responsible, then I think that that's going to actually mean that we don't have a lot of political capital to do as much investment as we'd like. Because I think the main thing that you need to do in a first term is show that, the economy doesn't collapse the moment you walk into 10 Downing Street and the country doesn't get invaded as soon as you walk into 10 Downing Street. And I think that if Labour can do that, I think in the second term they can actually do a lot more. But I think that, again,
so
I think
this 28 is more of, in your mind, like a second term thing?
I think that I think that they've already said that it's going to be later in the first term. So I think that it's going to start in the kind of latter half of the first term, and then kind of, I think the results are going to be seen by the public at the end of the second term, I think. But I think that, I think that the idea of kind of, the growth slowing down and that stopping kind of the investment. Well, I think that the investment is the way that I think Labour thinks it can get growth.
I would
Right?
agree. Yeah, like you don't get growth coming out of nowhere. Yeah, but then the debt to GDP situation, which is also very, very less secure of a situation. I think, which is what they're primarily focused on.
Yeah, which is why I think, again, because in my opinion, I think the main kind of two prongs of kind of Labour's plan for economic growth is that investment and also kind of reform of the planning system and of housing, which I think is actually going to do just as much, if not more, to kind of boost growth if it actually can get done. Because planning rules and kind of that's a very contentious issue in British politics. But I think that if you have that side by side, then I think that you actually can get high enough growth to mean that the debt to GDP ratio goes low enough that actually you can justify that kind of capital investment. So I think that. And I think that, again, the country has been so starved of any sort of investment that I think that there's a lot more opening and room in the terms of public acceptance of spending than there has been before. So I think that I mean, I do agree with you that the fact that kind of Keir Starmer definitely, when he gets into power, has to be able to kind of make that bet and make that decision. But I also have confidence in the fact that kind of as I always kind of say, we're not electing presidents here, right? At the end of the day, British politics is about parties. Prime ministers and leaders serve at the whims of parties. And I do think that, at the end of the day, when Labour gets in government, its main priority is going to be, making sure that it keeps its base in line. And because that base is trade unionists and, party members and, working class communities, I think that that's going to put enough pressure on Keir Starmer to make sure that these things do get passed.
Yeah. Let's hope so, because I feel like that is a very interesting thing we said about the acceptance of the willingness to maybe go a little more spending, maybe say a debt level that people wouldn't extraordinarily or normally be comfortable with. I mean, we saw that with Joe Biden and kind of the response to COVID. We kind of recognize that there's going to have to be some really major things done here. But there's also been times, where we've seen, at least from the Biden side, and also from Starmer as well, he has been extraordinarily, very rigid, and obviously when it comes to some of the base pressure, and really relying off of some of his recent friends that he was just talking to last week in the business sector. So it's going to be interesting to see if those voices kind of go more in the route like the CEO of Siemens and say, we need to have some sort of activity. The UK is just an economic wasteland. We need to have some sort of activity to get the fire going. I feel like that, that could also have the case of some sort of, investment being done. But if there is, especially, some sort of change in tax plans or something something that could also threaten some of the more business, not just the high street business, but more like the big businesses. That could be a source of pressure on Starmer. But hopefully he's able to see, as you said, the political winds being more in favor of some major investment happening after 14 now years of some pretty tough Tory austerity.
And if I may just say one last thing, because this has been a
Yeah.
very recent thing, I think it only came around yesterday, but I think Labour's also just recently unveiled a plan to pass a Race Equality Act, which would basically extend the kind of equal pay provisions in the Equal Pay Act, which is about kind of gender disparities in pay, to kind of, not only black and minorities, but also kind of disabled people. And I think that actually, I'm sure we'll get into that at some point at a later date, but I think that is a really, really good policy, and I can't wait to kind of make the case and evangelize it on the doorstep. So
Yeah. So and that idea of Labor coming out, I think coming out of the first kind of 100 days as American politics is a big benchmark. I don't know how big of a thing it is. Just coming in the UK, just coming out when you have that political momentum. When you're riding high off of what is expected to be a pretty big election victory, but obviously you don't want to get complacent from your perspective. Acknowledge that. But it will be obviously so important for Labour to come out and make these big policies, whether it be the kind of a race Equality of Pay Act, or whether it be the green investment, whether it be anything regarding that. I think that's going to be incredibly important. All right, so I think that brings us right up to an hour. We will say so long and see you next week. And thank you so much to Myron, and thank you so much to you for listening.